you have a Bible with you. If you have a Bible with you, turn to 2 Kings chapter 5. 2 Kings chapter 5. For the rest of this summer, what we intend to do is talk about stories from the Old Testament and things we can learn from those stories. And last week, we started in a story in 2 Kings chapter 5 with a fellow by the name of Naaman. I don't know that we'll finish the story this week. It's a long story. It's all of chapter 5 of 2 Kings. And if we don't finish today, we'll finish next week, Lord willing. But in this particular story of Naaman, as we read about and study him, he is from Aram. That's what some of the translations say. Syria would be the modern-day country, so some of the translations actually say Syria. He is a captain of the host over there. That means he's a high-ranking official. He has been given many victories by God, which is really interesting that God has given him victories because he's not an Israeli. He's not one of the Jewish people. As a matter of fact, he's actually made raids into Jewish territory, and in one of those raids, he captured a young lady and brought her back as one of his slaves, which was common in that day and time, that you took the booty, whatever it might be. It might be things, it might be animals, it might be people, but they took all those things and brought them back. So she's now a servant girl. This guy, in addition to being given victory by God, which is a little hard for us to understand because he's actually fighting against the people of God, in addition to being given people by God, he has this problem, and that problem is that he has leprosy. Now, leprosy was not a specific disease. It's actually a word that encompasses all kinds of skin diseases, including Hansen's disease. And in the Old Testament, in the Jewish way of doing things, under the hygienic law of the Old Testament, if he had been a Jewish soldier, he could not have been a soldier at all because of the fact that the people with leprosy had to be separated from the people. They couldn't be where the other folks were. But because he was a Syrian, he could. Yet, you can imagine how terrible this must be. I'm not going to paint a great verbal picture of this and don't want to show any pictures of what it might look like, but you can imagine somebody with a terrible skin disease, and these skin diseases were, the reason that people had to be separated was because they were potentially contagious, and many of them were, and there would be oozing sores. That's enough. You begin to see it. It had to be miserable to look at a person who had it. It had to be miserable to be the person who had it. You can imagine the discomfort, the itching, the scratching, all those kinds of things. And yet because he was such a great soldier, he still continued to be a commander. Now, this servant girl, this one that he had stolen in one of his raids, said, you know, what you need to do is you need to go over to Israel, actually to the area of Israel called Samaria. There's a prophet there, and that prophet can heal you. So he went to his master, which was the king of Aram, the king of Syria, and he told what the girl had said, and he said, okay, I'll give you a letter to take over there to that king. And so he did, and basically the letter to that king said, I'm here to be healed of my leprosy. Well, that caused great consternation in the king of Israel because he thought, this guy's just looking to pick a fight. There's no way I can do this. He had brought a fortune with him, by the way. He had brought 150 pounds of silver, 750 pounds of gold. We did a quick calculation the other day. Based on the price of a troy ounce of gold today, that's nearly $11 million in today's currency of gold, just the gold that he carried with him, and 10 garments. And I'm imagining that he didn't get these at Walmart. These probably were pretty expensive outfits that he brought with him. And so he comes to the king. The king's upset about it, but the prophet hears about it, and the prophet sends word to the king. And we'll start reading there in verse 8. It says, when Elisha, that's the prophet, when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he torn his clothes because he was upset. He sent to the king saying, why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel. As we pointed out last week, if you happen to be here, Elisha was a pretty arrogant guy. Notice that he didn't say that there is a God in Israel. He said that there's a prophet in Israel. And one of the points we made last week is that God can even use arrogant jerks. And this guy certainly appeared to be one. The next verse says, so Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood at the door of Elisha's house. Now he's expecting something amazing to occur. He's here. He's brought this fortune. He thinks this prophet's going to come out and do something great. Look at the next verse. And Elisha sent a messenger to him. By the way, that's rude in any culture. It would be rude in our culture. It's rude in that culture. As a matter of fact, even more rude in that culture that he didn't come outside to see his guest. Rather than coming outside, he just sent a messenger out. And the messenger said, go and wash in the Jordan, which was a river, 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean. The next verse says this, but Naaman was angry and went away, saying, behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Next verse. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. The next verse. But his servants came near and said to him, my father, it's a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? Has he actually said to you, wash and be clean? Next verse. So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. And there's more to the story, but let's just stop and talk about that for a minute. When we want God to do something for us, I think it's human nature that we want him to do it big. Now, the 4th of July just occurred. We love to see the fireworks. We don't have to go anywhere from our house. The people that live in the neighborhood right behind us apparently are very wealthy. And they buy fireworks, apparently $200,000 or $300,000 worth, based on what they shoot back there. And all weekend long, as a matter of fact, all weekend long, we could just sit on our back deck and watch them shoot all these wonderful things into the sky. And apparently one of them the other day went the wrong way because we could hear people screaming and running. But most of them were going into the sky and shooting all up there, and it's just like spectacular. We love to see those things. It's just amazing. God, I want you to do that. We love the meteor showers. We love the great miracles. We want everything to be big and good. Yet God doesn't always work that way. You recall that on one occasion when one of his prophets was running from an evil woman who had threatened to kill him, that prophet was hiding in the mountains, and that God makes all these manifestations of great power, but when he finally speaks to him, he speaks in a whisper. I think sometimes that's the greatest power there is when somebody just seems calm. As a matter of fact, when I was in college many years ago, back then, by the way, you could get a job on campus to help pay your tuition. It paid $1.50 an hour, which was just really good pay back in 1967. Anybody remember back that far? It's certainly not 750 pounds of gold, but $1.50 an hour. My job was to be one of the night watchmen, which meant we walked around campus and basically did nothing. There was a friend of mine who was also a night watchman. His name was David Fletcher. He was from New Orleans. David had come to, the night I met David was the night that he shot me. I'm not making that up. I actually walked into a dorm room, sat down. A fellow I didn't know sat down next to me. It was David. I found out later. And he put a pistol in my side and pulled the trigger and shot me. I screamed and yelled. It burned like all get out. Turned out it was just a blank pistol that he was shooting a blank out of. But that great burn on my side, I was convinced I had been shot. So we were friends forever. And then we were out there one night doing the night watchman thing, and these guys come on campus from out in the city somewhere, and they want to cause trouble. There's 6 of them in the car. That's back when you could put 6 people in a car. Remember those cars? And they started cutting donuts on the lawn in front of the cafeteria. I wanted to call the police. David just walked over there. They stopped the car. They were laughing. 6 guys. One walked up to them. I followed behind him, not to help, but to report. And I got close enough where I could hear, and he leaned in, and he whispered. He said, "You're on my grass." And they apologized and left. And I later trying to figure out, why did they do that? It was because he whispered. They knew that he had nothing to shout about. They knew this guy was so confident that a whisper would work. Does that make sense to you? I have so much confidence. I'm so convinced of my own authority, my own power. I don't have to be upset with you. God works that. By the way, David had already thrown a guy through the plate glass window at McDonald's earlier, so he knew he could do it. The guy insulted his sister. We learned not to do that. With this great power, you don't have to show much. You don't have to do much. And when we say, okay, God, I want you to do something that's amazing, great, this miracle where everybody can see what you're doing, God's response sometimes is, no, I just want to whisper. I want to do something that other people may not even pay attention to. As a matter of fact, that other people could even question, was it me? Sometimes he works that way. And so he said to Naaman through this prophet, go dip yourself 7 times in the Jordan River. There is no healing power in the Jordan River. Yet some people after that might think there would be, and there might be a whole flood of lepers running to the Jordan River trying to replicate what Naaman had done just to see if it would work. But that's not what's happening here. The power is not in the Jordan River. The power is in God. And when this man was going to leave because God wasn't going to do it the way he wanted it to be done, it's when his people said, you know, if he'd asked you to do some great thing, you would have done it. Why not just do the little thing he asked you to do? Now, the next verse gets interesting to the story. If we can find the next verse and slap it back up there. Then he returned to the man of God, he and all his company, and he came and stood before him, and he said, behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. So accept now a present from your servant. Before we go to the next verse, did you hear what he just said? This has convinced me that the only God, the only true and real and powerful God is your God. He's convinced of that now. And then he says, so I want to give you a gift. He has brought millions of dollars. I want to give you a gift. The next verse. But he said, and this he being the prophet, as the Lord lives before whom I stand, I will receive none. And he, that is Naaman, urged him, that is the prophet, to take it, but he refused. By the way, there is no sin in the prophet taking that money. As a matter of fact, all through the Bible, you'll find that people would give gifts to the prophets. You go all the way back to Abraham, who gave a gift to Melchizedek. As a matter of fact, he gave 10% of everything he had gotten in the spoils of war to Melchizedek. He gave it to Melchizedek, who was a priest of God. And the New Testament would say it like this, that you don't muzzle the ox. If he's going to tread the corn, if he's going to work the corn, you can feed him from the corn. Paul would say, I could even receive money for doing what I do. It's not a sin to do that. Now, this church has some staff members, but all of your staff members are part-time. As a matter of fact, the last church I worked with, the worship minister made more than all of the entire staff of this church make together. So it's not that we're talking about, hey, pay us because we want to get rich. That's not the point. The point is that this man could have taken that money and it would have been okay, except he didn't do it this time for a specific reason. At the end of the chapter, he will say, at this time. What he was saying is this: I could have done it. It would have been okay, but this was not the appropriate time to do it. Why was it not the appropriate time to do it? Because he was trying to teach Naaman that you don't buy God. That you can't come with millions and millions of dollars and based on what you have, you can get God to do things for you. He wanted Naaman to know you came in power, you came with money, you came with all these kinds of things, and I need you to understand that God is not bribed. That God is not purchased, that God does what God wants to do when God chooses to do it. Therefore, though I could take the money from you, I'm not taking the money from you because I want you to know what God is really like. And no matter how much Naaman urged him to take the money, he refused. So look at the next verse. Then Naaman said, if not, in other words, if you're not going to take this money, please let there be given to your servant 2 mules load of earth. What's happening now is based on the fact that Naaman wouldn't take the money. Notice that. If not, since you're not taking the money, I've learned even more. And because I've learned any more, this is what I'm asking you. I want you to give me 2 mules worth of dirt. In other words, as much dirt as 2 mules can carry. And from now on, your servant will not offer burnt offering or sacrifice to any god but the Lord. So, obviously, what Elisha was trying to do succeeded. He showed this man, I'm not like the other deities you've worshipped, or God is not like the other deities you have worshipped. God is the God of all. God is over everything. God can do anything, and you can't purchase him. You can't buy him. You do understand that in most of the religions of the world, not all, but in most of the religions of the world, it's actually set up where you do buy favors from God. You buy favors from God by doing this. You buy favors from God by doing that. Even in some of the forms of Christianity, it is set up that you buy favors from God. He's saying that is not the way God operates. God never owes you anything. Now, when he understood that, okay, give me some dirt. I'm going to take this dirt back home, and that's what I'm going to use it for. I'm going to use it to worship. You say, well, why did he need the dirt? Well, he didn't. But in that day and time, as a matter of fact, the argument would go on even into the New Testament. In that day and time, people thought that where you worshiped was extremely important. You may remember that when Jesus met a woman referred to as the Samaritan woman, that she said, you know, my ancestors say this is the right place to worship. Your ancestors say that's the right place to worship. Jesus said the time is coming when there won't be any place at all. That's going to be what happens in your heart. And so in that part of the world, in that time, people were really very specific about where they worshiped. There is a major world religion that when they pray, and they pray 5 times a day, that when they pray, they actually point themselves toward a certain geographical, I should say, location, because they believe that's where you have to point yourself to be able to pray effectively. God is not limited to a certain place. God is not limited to a certain piece of soil. God is not limited to a certain building. God is everywhere, which means that you could worship God in the forest, you could worship God in the desert, you could worship God on the mountain, you could worship God in a building. It really makes no difference. But back then, they thought it did. And so he said, give me some of your dirt. Now, there's some good and bad. There's some pros and cons to this. The con could be that when you, let me go with the pro first. The pro could be that you can have something that can remind you to worship. And actually, that would be okay. That I have this, it's not an idol, it's not something that I think I worship it, but this can be something that reminds me. Theoretically, and I say theoretically because it doesn't always work, but the way it's supposed to work is that when we take communion, for example, in church, when we take that unleavened bread, when we take the fruit of the vine, it is to be something that reminds us that there is a God, that Jesus did die for us, and to remind us of what he did. So there's nothing wrong in having something to be a reminder. The problem can be one of two things. One is the reminder becomes totally useless because you have it so often and so long it means nothing at all. For example,